Hey, what's going on, developers? In this video, we are going to create and clone this real estate project. As you can see, we have a homepage here in which we are going to render all the properties that the users added in this platform. We're going to have a search bar here, and here we're going to have the pagination for the properties. And then if I click on each properties here, we go to the property details page and we can see the details of the property. And also we're going to implement the authentication in this project. If I click on the sign in here, we can sign in with our email account or with our Google account and also with our X account. So I'm going to log in with my Google account here. And now you can see I'm signed in the application, and we can go to the user profile here. We can see the details about the user. We can also upload and change the user avatar with a new file. And here we can purchase a subscription in our application. So if I click on that, you can see the plans that we have defined in this application. We can buy, for example, this one, and we can actually create a payment here with the Stripe in our application. So let's get back to the application, and here we can go to the user's properties. We have a list of the properties that has been posted by the current user, and we can see the details of each property. We can edit the property, and also we can delete the property. So if I click on the delete here, we can see we have a modal here that I need to confirm that I want to delete the property. So here, as you can see, the URL has been changed. So we have implemented the intercepting routes and parallel routes of the Next.js. So you will learn these two concepts, which is really important in the Next.js in this tutorial as well. Also, we can add a new property here. So if I click on the add property, we go to the add property form here, which is a 5 steps form here. So in the first step, we need to enter the basic data about the property. So let me put some dummy data here. I go to the next step, which is the location. So you can see we have sliding stepper on the top of this form. We're going to create this stepper component in this tutorial from scratch. Okay, and in the location step, we need to add the data about the location of the property. So if I click on the next here, we can see we have the form validation on each step. So let me put some dummy data here again. I go to the next step and then put some dummy data about the features of the property. Okay, go to the next step. We can upload the images about the property. We can upload multiple files here, and we can delete each one if we want. Okay, and we can save the property. So now let me show you the concept that you will learn in this tutorial. So these are the basic and core concept of the Next.js for creating a real-world full-stack project. You will learn the routing system of the Next.js, including the intercepting and parallel routes of the Next.js routing system. You will learn how to handle forms and validate forms in the Next.js. You will also learn how to create the server actions in the right way. Then you will learn about the authentication process in the Next.js, and you will learn how to authenticate your users based on their emails or their Google account and also their X account, and how to protect some pages of your application from unauthenticated users. You will also learn how to set up a file upload mechanism for uploading your files on a cloud-based system. And then you will learn how to integrate the Prisma with your Next.js application with a real-world database schema with all its underlying relationships. And finally, you will learn how to integrate the Stripe in your Next.js application for handling the online payments of the user. So if you want to learn how to create a real-world full-stack project with Next.js, this tutorial is for you. So without extra explanation, let's get into it. In this section, we are going to create our Next.js project. So in order to do that, we're going to use npx and then create next app @latest, because we are going to create our Next.js project with the latest version of the Next.js. It asks me the name of the project, so I'm going to go with the Next.js real estate clone. And then yes, we are going to use the TypeScript ESLint. Also, we are going to use Tailwind CSS. And let's go with the default option here. We're going to use the src directory, although it is not really important to use the src directory. And here is the most important option in creating our Next.js project. We're going to use the app router in this project. So we're going to select the yes here. Okay, and we're going to go with the default alias, and let's wait until all the packages are installed by the npm, and it creates the Next.js project for us. Okay, as you can see, it's done, and npm creates the Next.js project for us. So here we need to go to the projects directory. I'm going to use the cd and then name of the project, which is Next.js real estate clone. And then we're going to open our project in the VS Code. And now let's run the dev server of this Next.js project. So I'm going to use npm run dev, and let's open it in our browser. And here we go. This is our Next.js project, and that's it for this section. And now let's go to the next section. In this section, we are going to set up the database for our application with Prisma. The first thing we need to do here is to install the Prisma. So in the terminal, I'm going to say npm I Prisma and then -- save dev, because it is going to be a dev dependency. Okay, it is installed, and before moving forward, I'm going to mention that in this video, you don't need to have a prior knowledge about the Prisma. I will teach you everything you need to know about Prisma for this project. But if you're looking for a comprehensive tutorial for mastering the Prisma, I recommend you to watch this video. This is a comprehensive tutorial for Prisma, and you will learn all you need to know about the Prisma in this comprehensive tutorial. So now let's get back to our project. We have installed the Prisma, and now we need to initialize the Prisma. So in order to do that, let me clear the terminal. Okay, and then for initializing the Prisma, I'm going to say npx and then Prisma init and then -- data source provider, and set it to SQLite. Okay, so in this video, we are going to use SQLite as the database management system. So let's run this script now. Okay, it is done. And if you're looking here in the Explorer, you can see now we have a Prisma directory in the root path of our project. So if I open it, you can see we have a Prisma schema inside it. And here inside it, first we have the client provider, which has been set to the Prisma client.js, which means that we are going to use Prisma inside a JavaScript application. And then we have the data source provider, which has been set to SQLite, and then the URL of our database is read from an env variable inside our env file, and the name of the variable inside it is the database URL. So if I go to the env file, you can see we have the database URL variable, and it is set to a file and its path and name, which has been set to the /dev.db, and it means that it is going to create a dev.db file, a SQLite database file inside the same directory that the schema.prisma is located. Okay, so now let's get back to the Prisma schema here, and later if we want to change our database to, for example, PostgreSQL or even MongoDB, we can simply change the providers to our favorite database, and then we just need to change the database URL inside the env file, and the Prisma will handle the rest for us. We don't need to do anything more about it, and this is one of the beauties of the Prisma. So now in the next step, we need to create our models. So a model in Prisma corresponds to a table inside our physical database. So it means that instead of creating the tables inside our physical database manually, we can define the tables in the Prisma schema here, and then we can run a migration, and then the Prisma will create the tables inside our database from this schema file. So for example, now let's create the user model for our application. So in order to do that, here we're going to say model and then the name of the model, which is going to be user. Okay, and then inside it, we're going to define the fields inside the table of the user. The first one is the ID, which is going to be a string. Okay, and it is going to be ID of the user. So here, ID decorator means that it is going to be the primary key of this table. And then we are going to have a first name. Okay, it is going to be string as well. Then we're going to have the last name, which is going to be string as well. And we are going to have a email. It is also a string, a avatar, URL, which is actually the URL of the profile picture of the user. It is also a string, and in order to allow the null value inside the avatar URL, we can put a question mark after the data type of this field. It means that this field in our database can have null values. And the last one for now is the created at, which actually is the date and time that the user is created. So here we're going to set its data type to date time, and we are going to use a default decorator, and inside it we can call the now function. It means that with the default decorator we can define a default value for this field, and inside it we have called the now function. So it means that the default value for this field is the date and time when the user is being inserted into this table. So for now, this is our user model, and later in this video we are going to create other models in this schema, and we need to set up relationships between the user table and the other table. So for now, that's it enough for the user model. And now I'm going to create a diagram for the schema of this project, and as we are moving on with this project and create more tables in this schema, we are going to update our diagram and visualize the relationship between the tables inside our database so we can understand the database structure in this project. So in order to create the diagram for this schema, I go to my browser and go to an online tool for creating the diagram for our database schema. So I'm going to create a new diagram here, and it is going to be an entity relationship. Let's remove the default one, and here we're going to have the user table. Let's define the icon for the users table. Okay, and now we can define the field inside it. We have the ID, which is going to be string. It is also our primary key. Okay, first name string and last name string. Okay, email also string, and avatar URL is going to be string as well. And also the last one, which is the created at. Okay, it is going to be date time. And here let's fix the avatar URL. We're gonna change the first letter of the avatar to lowercase. Okay, so this is our user model, and as we add more models into our schema, we're gonna put them here inside this diagram, and it actually helps us to understand the overall structure of our database, and we can understand it and use it easier. So now let's get back to our VS Code, and we have actually created our first model, and now we need to run a migration for the Prisma. It first creates the SQLite database for us and then create the user table inside our database. Okay, so let's save this and open up our terminal. So here, in order to run a migration, we're going to say npx prisma migrate dev. I'm going to go with the first migration. The name is actually up to you, and let's run it. So as you can see, it first installed the Prisma client for us, so we don't need to install the Prisma client with the npm command. And then it creates the dev.db file, and here it creates the migration. So if I go here, you can see we have a create table script in the SQL language that creates the table for us. So after creating the database, Prisma will run this script and create the table for us inside our database. So now we can run the Prisma Studio to see what is going on in our database. So here, let's first clear the terminal, and I'm going to say npx prisma studio. So as you can see here, we have the user model, and this is the fields inside our user model, and you can see there is no data inside our table yet. Okay, so as the last step in this section, we are going to create a global Prisma client for doing the CRUD operation in our application. So let's get back to the VS Code. Let's close the terminal, and here inside the src directory, I'm going to create a lib directory, and then inside it we're going to create the prisma.ts file. Okay, so here in this prisma.ts file, we're going to create and export a global Prisma client instance that we can use for CRUD operation anywhere inside our application. Generally, when we are going to do CRUD operation with Prisma, we need to create a new instance of the Prisma client class. But here we want to create one global Prisma client instance and export it from this file. So anytime, anywhere inside our project, we can use this global Prisma client. So every time we are going to do a CRUD operation in our application, we don't need to create a new instance of the Prisma client class. We just use this one and only global Prisma client. Okay, so here we are going to create a global for Prisma object. We're going to say const global for Prisma. Okay, and then set it to global and then cast its type to unknown. And furthermore, let's cast its type to an object which has Prisma inside it, and this Prisma member is type of Prisma client class. So you should import the Prisma client from the @prisma/client. Okay, so our global for Prisma object is actually a container for keeping our global Prisma client instance. So now here we are going to create and export a Prisma client, export const Prisma, and here we need to create a new instance of the Prisma client class. And here first we need to check if there is already a Prisma client instance inside the global for Prisma object. We don't need to create a new one, and we can just set this Prisma object to our already created global Prisma client. So here we can check inside the global for Prisma object. If there is not a Prisma instance inside it, it means that the Prisma instance inside it is undefined. We can create a new one. So here I'm going to say new Prisma client. Okay, so again, this might be a little complicated, but we first check if there is already a Prisma instance inside the global for Prisma object. We can set it to our global Prisma object, this object. And if there is not already a Prisma class inside the global for Prisma object, we can just create a new instance of the Prisma client. And then here we need to check if we are not in the production mode. So let's check. I'm going to say if the process.env, that node env is not equal to production, we need to set the global Prisma inside the global for Prisma to that Prisma client that we have created. Okay, and then we need to just export default the Prisma client. That's it. We have created and export one global Prisma client, and anywhere, anytime in our application when we need to do CRUD operation, we can import and use this Prisma client instance. So that's it for this section, and in the next section we are going to set up the authentication system for our application. In this section, we are going to set up the authentication for our Next.js application. To this end, we are going to use KindAuth for the authentication. So here I'm in the kind.com, and here click start for free. Let's log in with our Google account. I'm going to choose my email account. Here we need to choose a name for our business. So here I'm going to say SK Real Estate. Okay. And then here we can choose the region. I'm going to click on the next, and here click on the use kind with my existing code base. So, and that's because we have already created our Next.js application. Click on next again. Here choose the Next.js. Okay, and here we need to turn on the ways of authentication. We have the email authentication, and also we're going to choose the Google and also X. Okay, and then click on the next, and then click on the connect here, and then here we just need to set the address of our application, and since we are using the dev server, we'll leave it here with the localhost 3000. And after pushing the project to the production environment, we can change this URL to the web address of our application. And here we need to install the KindAuth. So I just copy that and get back to the VS Code. Okay, open up the terminal, and here let's clear this up and let's paste the script here for installing the KindAuth in our Next.js project. Okay, and then we need to go back to the KindAuth documentation and let's copy the env variables here. We need to put them inside our env file. So let's get back to the VS Code, and here inside the env file we need to paste them here. So here let's create a comment here, KindAuth. Okay, and then we need to paste the env variables and along with their values here inside the env file. And all we need to do here is to change the KindAuth post login redirect URL to the homepage of our application because we don't have a /dashboard route in our Next.js project. So after the user log out from our application, we're going to redirect it to the homepage of our application, and after user login into our application, the KindAuth also redirected to the homepage of our application. Okay, so let's save this and let's get back to the browser and KindAuth documentation. So here we need to create an API API route inside our app directory and copy this code inside the route handler. So let's get back to the VS Code and go to the app directory here. I'm going to create an API directory here inside the app directory, and then inside it we're going to create the auth directory, and then inside it we need to create a dynamic route for the kind auth. We need to name it kind auth and pay attention to the spelling here, and then inside it finally we need to create our route.ts file. Okay, and then here in the route handler we just need to paste the code that we've got from the documentation of the kind auth. So let's save this, and that's it. We have configured the kind auth in our Next.js application. And in the upcoming section of this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can implement the page protection with the kind auth. So for now, let's get right into the next section. In this section, we are going to integrate the Next UI library as the UI library in our Next.js application. So I go to my browser and open up the nextui.org. It's a UI library that is based on the Tailwind CSS that has a bunch of really nice looking UI components. So now let's install it in our application. I go to the documentation, and here in the Next.js, let's scroll down here. So this script is for creating a Next.js application with the Next UI installed by default. So we don't need that because we already have our Next.js application. So we just need to copy this script here for installing the Next UI. So here, as you can see, Next UI uses the frame motion. So we need to install the Next UI/React and then frame motion. So let's get back to the VS Code and let's close this up first and paste the script for installing these two libraries. Okay, so now let's get back to the browser and the Next UI documentation. Here we need to change a little bit the tailwind.config file. So now let's copy this line here, okay, and then get back to the VS Code, go to the tailwind.config file, and here in the contents, let's copy the code here, and let's get back to the browser and also copy the dark mode section and plugin section and get back to the VS Code. Let's replace it with these two lines of code, and we just need to import the Next UI function from the Next UI library. Okay, so now let's get back to the documentation again, and here we need to create a provider component and put this component inside our main layout. So let's copy the component code and get back to the VS Code. Inside the app directory here, we're going to need to create a components directory, and inside it we're going to create a providers.tsx file, and inside this file we're going to paste the code that we've got from the documentation of the Next UI. So as you can see, it's a client component that wrap its children inside a Next UI provider. So probably this is a React context API provider, and that's because we need to mark it with the use client. And then we need to go to the root layout of our application, and here we need to wrap the children of the root layout with this providers component. So I'm going to put it here, okay, and wrap the children inside this providers component. So as you just noticed here, the providers component is a client component. And you might ask, wrapping the children of the root layout of our application inside the client component, the providers component, does this turn the whole application to client components? The answer is no. We can have server component wrapped by client component in our application. This doesn't turn them to client component. But if we use server component directly inside the JSX of a client component, yes, that will turn the server component to a client component. As you can see here, we haven't used the children directly inside the JSX of the providers component. We just wrap it inside the client component, and that will not turn the children to client components. And for more information, you can watch this video. So that's it for this section. We have successfully integrated the Next UI library with our Next.js application. Now let's get to the next section. In this section, we are going to create a navbar for our application. So we need to create something like this. We're going to create a navbar and create a sign-in panel in the app bar. And also we need to create a logo section for the navbar. So now let's go back to the VS Code and create that. To start with, in the components directory inside the app directory, I'm going to create a component and call it appbar. I don't name it Navbar because I'm going to use the Navbar component of the Next UI library. So I named this component to appbar. Okay, now let's create a React component. And then here in the appbar, I'm going to use the Navbar component of the Next UI. So I go to the Next UI library, and here in the component section, I scroll down to find the Navbar component. Okay, and here let's scroll down to find the navbar with the menu. So we need to create something like this that is responsive. So let's go to the code section and copy the code here. Okay, let's copy that and get back to the VS Code. Just paste them here inside the appbar component. We need to import the missing imports. Okay, and for the menu, we need to create a state that determines whether the menu is open or not. So let's get back to the Next UI, and here let's copy the use state here, get back to VS Code and paste it here. Okay, run our application, npm run dev. Okay, we haven't put the appbar component in the root layout of our application. So now let's get back to the VS Code, put the navbar here in the root layout, and also we need to remove the default page of our Next.js project. So let's get back to VS Code here. First, I go to the page.tsx and let's remove the content. Okay, I scroll down all the way to the end of the main page, and here let's put an empty div here. And then let's get back to the root layout of our application. Here before the children and inside the providers, we're going to put the appbar component. Let's get back to the browser. Let's refresh. Okay, so it says that we need to mark it with the use client. Let's get back to the VS Code, and here in the appbar component, let's mark it with the use client. And let's close the terminal here. We need to remove the default logo here. Let's remove the items inside the navbar menus. Okay, nice. And get back to the browser. You can see we have the navbar here. Let's go back to the VS Code and go to the global.css file here in the app directory. Let's remove all the default CSS code that comes with the Next.js project. Let's save this and get back to the browser. Now we have the navbar without any extra styling. We need to add a shadow for our navbar. So I go to the VS Code and into the appbar component. Okay, here in the navbar, let's add a class name here and use shadow MD of the Tailwind CSS. Get back to browser. Now we can see we have the nice shadow here. Now let's change the logo here. Get back to VS Code, and here inside the navbar brand, we need to put a logo here. I'm going to use a home icon for our logo here, and for the icon library, I'm going to use the hero icons library, which is highly compatible with the Tailwind CSS. So I go to the heroicons.com and go to the documentation here and scroll down to find the script for installing the hero icons. Get back to VS Code, open up a terminal, create a new terminal here, and then paste the script for installing the hero icons. Okay, and now we can use the home icon in the navbar brand. So the hero icons library offers the icons as React components. So here we can import the home modern icon and then put a class name here. We're going to use W16 for its width here. Okay, and then in the p tag here, we need to change the name of the brand to, for example, SK Real Estate. SK stands for Sakura. Okay, and then we need to put them inside the link component of the Next.js. Okay, so I use the link component that come from the Next.js. So as you can see here, we have imported the link from the next/link. Get back to the navbar brand. We need to wrap the icon and the p tag inside the link here. Then we need to set the href to the homepage of our application. Let's save this and get back to the browser. We need to make it a little smaller. So here in the home modern icon, oh, I forgot to put a dash here, so I fixed that. Back to the browser, and now we can see that the icon is there. So we need to put the logo and the p tag side by side. So I go back to VS Code and in the link component, let's add a class name here. First, we need to add flex because we are going to put them side by side. Item center, text primary 400, and when hover, we are going to set the text color to text primary 600, and then we're going to put a transition here, and let's only put the transition on colors. Okay, so let's save this, get back to the browser. Now the logo and the p tag are side by side, and when we hover them, their color is changed. Let's get back to VS Code here. We need to fix the text primary 400 here. Get back to browser. You can see now the logo has a better color. Now let's remove the items here, and as we move on through this project, we're going to add our navbar items here. So for now, let's remove them here in the navbar content. Let's remove the 3 navbar items. Okay, so as you can see, each navbar content has a justify props that specify the position of the navbar content. So as you can see here, we have the justify with end, which means that the navbar content will be pushed all the way to the end of the navbar. And here you can see that the justify of the items that we have just deleted is set to the center. Okay, and then here in the nav content with the justify end, we have 2 link here with login. We're going to use our custom sign-in panel, so we need to remove them and then create our own sign-in panel and put it here. Okay, so in the next section, we are going to create our sign-in panel. Now let's create the sign-in panel component and put it here inside the navbar content with the justify end. So here in the components directory, I'm going to create a component called sign-in-panel.tsx. Let's create a functional component. Now here we need to check if the user is authenticated or not. If the user is authenticated, we need to show the profile page of the user. But if the user is not authenticated, we need to render a sign in and a sign up button. So for now, let's check if the user is not authenticated and then show the sign in and sign up buttons. First, in order to check the authentication status of the user, we're going to use the getKind server session. So now let's use the getKind server session. First, we need to set this component to an async component. Okay, and then here I'm going to say await getKind server session. So here, as you can see, it will import the kind server session from the kind OSS kind of Next.js, dist type, and then server. So we need to fix that. We need to import it from this path, kind OSS, kind of Next.js, and then just server. Otherwise, it won't work properly. Okay, so in this way, we can access to the session of the kind of in the server. Then we need to set the returning object of this function to an object here. So I'm going to say const and set it to an object and grab the is authenticated from this session and then call await is authenticated function. So if the user is authenticated, we're going to need to render the name of the user. And if the user is not authenticated, we're going to render the sign in and sign up button. So for now, if the user is authenticated, we just render the name of the user. So in order to get the name of the user, we need to extract the get user function from the getKind server session, and then we can grab the user here. So I'm going to say const user and set it to await and then call the get user function. So I use await here and then get user. So in this way, we can access to the current authenticated user. And then here we can just render user dot, for example, given name. Okay, and then if the user is not authenticated, we can return the sign in and sign up button. So here I'm going to return a div here, and let's set a class name for that. We're going to put the buttons side by side. So I'll use flex here and gap 3 for the gap between the 2 buttons. And here inside it, we can render a button component from the Next UI React. We're going to set its color to primary, and then inside this button, we are going to render a link component from the kind of. Actually, this is a pre-built login link for signing in the user. So here I'm going to use that component login link that comes from the kind of. We can set a caption here. For example, we can set the caption to sign in. Okay, and then we're gonna add the other button for sign up. So here I'm gonna create the second button, and inside it we're gonna render the register link, another pre-built link from NextAuth that is used for registering a new user. So here I'm gonna use the register link that comes from the NextAuth, and for the caption I'm gonna use sign up. Let's save this, and now we can go to the app bar component and put the sign-in panel here inside the Navbar content. But here there is a problem. The app bar component is a client component. And if we use the sign-in component, which is a server component, directly here in the JSX of the app bar component, it will be turned to a client component. So how we can fix that? We can render the sign-in panel as the children of the app bar component. So I go back here at the top level of the app bar component. I'm going to define an interface for the props of this app bar component. Interface props. Okay, and then here we're going to say that it is going to have children prop, which is going to be a React node. Now we can use the children here. First, we need to set the type of the props to the props interface that we have just created, and then let's grab the children from the props of the app bar component. Then here we are going to render the children of the app bar here inside the Navbar content with the justify end. Okay, so now as you can see in the root layout of our application, we have an error, and that's because we need to specify the children of this app bar component. So inside the app bar in the root layout, we are going to render the sign in panel, and let's import it from the sign in panel.tsx file inside the components directory. Now let's go to the browser. We can see we have a sign in and sign up buttons inside our Navbar. So if I click on the sign in, it will redirect us to the NextAuth sign in page. We can use the email authentication, or we can sign in with our Google account. So let's go and sign in with our Google account. Let's choose our email account here. Okay, it says that we can't find your account, and that's because we are signing in into our application for the first time. So we need to create the account here. Okay, now you can see the name of the user here in the app bar. So if I go back into the sign-in panel, you can see first we check if the user is authenticated. We render the username in the sign-in panel. Otherwise, if the user is not authenticated, we are rendering the sign-in and sign-up buttons. And that is the beauty of the NextAuth. Now, instead of just plainly render the name of the user when the user is authenticated, just render a profile panel for the user. So in the next section, we are going to create a profile panel for the user and render it instead of just plainly rendering the name of the user. So that's it for this section. And in the upcoming section, first we are going to save the user, open its sign up in our local database, and then we are going to create a profile panel and render it when the user is authenticated instead of just plainly rendering the name of the user here in the app bar panel. So now let's get right to the next section. In this section, we are going to save the user inside our local database when the user sign up for the first time in our application. So we are keeping the data about the user not just on the NextAuth, but also inside our local database. So if I go to the env file and see the variables of the NextAuth, you can see we have a login redirect URL. So we can create an API route for our application for saving the user inside our database, and then set it here in the post login redirect URL variable of the NextAuth. So inside the API directory and inside the auth directory, I'm going to create a new route called success, and then here inside it we can create the route handler, route.ts file. Here we are going to create a get function. So I'm going to say export async function get, and then here first we need to access to the NextAuth session and get the authenticated user from the NextAuth session. So again, we need to call the get server session. Again, we need to remove the dist/types from the importing path. We need to import it directly from the OSS, NextAuth Next.js, and then server. Okay, here we can call that, and then we can grab the get user function from the returning object of the get server session. So here I'm going to say const, and then grab the get user from that. Okay, And then here we can access to the user const user and set it to the returning object of the get user function. It's an async function, so we need to use await here and then call the get user function. Then we are going to check if the user is not undefined. So here I'm going to say if not user, which means that the user is undefined, or user is null, or the user.id is undefined. So I put a not here, then user.id. So in these cases, we are going to throw an error here, throw new error, and say something like this: something went wrong with authentication, and then put the user after that. Okay, and then here if we pass through this exception, it means that the user is authenticated, and then we need to check inside our database if such a user is already existed in our database or not. If it is not existed in our database, it means that it is signing in into our application for the first time. So we need to insert the user data into our local database. So first we're going to check if the user is inside our database or not. I'm going to say const db user, which actually is the user that is retrieved from our database. We're going to use the await here and then call the Prisma, our Prisma global client, which comes from the lib/Prisma file, the file that we have created in the previous sections. So we're going to use that global client, and then from user model, we're going to call the find unique. Okay, we need to pass a configuration object here. Here inside it, we're going to specify the where API, and here we are saying that we are going to find the user based on its ID. So we're going to set the ID of the user to the user that we've got from the get user function of the current server session, and then pass the ID. Okay, and that's it. We can easily retrieve the user by its ID from our database. Prisma will handle that for us. And then we're going to check if the user is not available. So put not here and then db.user. It means that the user is not existed in our database. So we need to insert the user into our database. So inside the if here, we're going to call the Prisma create function. So we're going to use await here and then Prisma, our global Prisma client, user.create. So this create function is for inserting a new user into our database. Pass the configuration object, specify the data. Here we are going to set the ID of the user to the user.id. So keep in mind that the user.id is coming from the kind auth. So it means that the kind auth will initialize the user ID for us. We're going to set the first name to the user.given name, and we need to put a exclamation mark here, or we can use a double question mark and pass the empty string if the user that given name is not available. Okay, and then we're going to do the same with the last name. Set it to user.family name. We're going to set the email to the user.email, and that's it. With this function, we insert the new user into our database. And then here we just need to redirect the user to the homepage of our application. So after the create function, we are going to call the redirect function from the next response. So we're going to return the next response and call the redirect function and pass the homepage address of our application. So that's it for the user creation API. And we need to tell the kind auth when the user successfully logging into our application, just call this API. So I go to the env file, and here we need to just specify the address of our API for inserting the new user into our database. So it's on the /API/auth and then /success. Okay, so now let's go back to the browser. Let's sign out. So in order to sign out, we need to use the logout link from the kind auth. So let's get back to the VS Code and to the sign in panel. Here just put a logout link from the kind auth and just say log out. We're going to create a user profile panel in the next section and put it here inside this messy username and logout. But for now, let's just put logout link here and get back to the browser. Let's click on the logout. Now let's run the Prisma Studio to see what is going on inside our database. In the terminal, I'm going to say npx Prisma Studio. Okay, so as you can see, the user table doesn't have any record inside it. So let's keep it open and click on the sign in here. Let's log in with our Google account. It calls the API auth success. I think I misspelled the address of the API route in the env file. Let's get back to the VS Code and let's fix it here. Okay, and let's get back to the browser. Let's get back and let's log out again, sign in, choose our Google account, and as you can see here, we have signed in into our application. And if I go to the Prisma Studio and refresh, we can see now we have a record inside our user table. So in this way, we can keep our user data inside our local database as well as in the kind auth. So that's it for saving the user inside our local database. And in the next section, we are going to create the profile panel and put it here instead of name of the user and log out panel. In this section, we are going to create the user profile panel. So I go back to the VS Code, and here inside the components directory, in the app directory, we're going to create a user profile panel component profile panel.tsx. Here we are going to create a React component. We're going to create an interface for the props of the component. We're going to name it props, and then here inside it, we're going to have a user, which is going to be type of the user that comes from the database. So we need to set its type to the user type that comes from the Prisma client. So we are going to set it here, set it to the user that comes from the Prisma client. Okay, and then here we can actually access the user props. So first we need to set the type of the props to the props interface and then grab the user from it. Okay, and for now, let's put the user profile panel inside the sign-in panel. So here, if the user is authenticated, instead of rendering the username logout link, we are going to render a user profile panel. Okay, so we need to set the user props. So here, first we need to retrieve the user from our database. So I'm going to say const db user, which is the user that comes from the database. So here, in order to set that, we're going to call the Prisma client await Prisma that comes from the lib.prisma file, our global Prisma client, then call the user.find unique, pass the where API. We're going to find it based on its ID and set its ID to the user.id. So the user object here comes from the get user function from the kind server session. Okay, and then here we need to set the user to the db user in the user profile panel. So since the user might be undefined, first we need to check if the user is not undefined. So we need to render a React fragment and then put the user profile inside it. And here we're going to check if the user db user is not undefined. So I put 2 exclamation mark here because it will turn the db user object to boolean object, and then we are going to use the conditional rendering. And here, as you can see, if the db user is not undefined, we're going to render the user profile panel and pass the db user inside it. So let's get back to the user profile panel, and here we are going to use a Next UI component. So I go to the Next UI and go to the component section, and here I'm going to scroll down for the drop down, and let's find our proper drop down menu. We're going to use this one. So I go to the code section and copy the second drop down. Let's copy the JSX and get back to the VS Code and paste it here instead of this plain div. Okay, let's import the missing imports, and here we have the drop down trigger. So if we click on the item inside the drop down trigger, it will actually open up the drop down menu. Let's save this for now. And here we have a conflict between the user component that comes from the Next UI and the user type that comes from the Prisma client. So let's change the user type from the Prisma client to Prisma user. Okay, and then here set the type of the user to Prisma user. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see the user panel here. So now let's click on that. It gives us an error, and that's because we need to turn this component to a client component. So I get back to the VS Code, and here inside the user profile panel, we're going to mark it with the use client directive. Get back to the browser. You can see now we have a nice drop down menu. If we click on the user button. So now we need to customize this user profile panel. Get back to VS Code, and here first we need to remove all the drop down menu items except the log out. So here in the log out drop down menu item, inside we need to render a log out link from the kind auth. So here I put the log out link that comes from the kind auth and put the log out text inside the log out link. Now let's get back to the browser. If I click on that, we only have a log out link. If I click on the log out link, it gives us a runtime error. It's happening in the sign in panel. So let's get back to the VS Code, and here in the sign in panel, here when the user sign out from our application, the get user function will return undefined. So the user object here is undefined, and here we are going to use the user object which is undefined, so it will raise an error. So in order to fix that, we need to put this to function inside the if block here. So if the user is authenticated, we are going to get the user and then retrieve the user based on the user of the kind server session. So here first we need to put a block here below the div here, and then move the return statement into the if block, and also let's move down this into the if statement block. So now if the user is authenticated, we are going to find it inside our database. Let's get back to the browser. Now you can see the error is gone. So now let's again click on the sign in. Let's log in again, choose our email account. Okay, it again rendered the user panel. So now let's put the real name of the user here, get back to VS Code and go to the user profile panel, and here we don't need the description section, but here in the name prop we are going to set it to name of the user. So we're going to use a backticks here and first render the user that first name, then put a space here, and then render the user dot last name. Again, this user is coming from the user props of the component, and here in the user component, actually it's this circle avatar of the user. We need to actually render the profile picture of the user. So here in the src props of the avatar props, we are going to set it to user.avatar URL, or if it's undefined, we need to put the address of a default profile icon. So I've already put a profile icon picture inside the public directory of our Next.js application. This is the picture, and here in the user component, we can set it as the default profile picture of the user if the avatar URL is undefined. Profile.png. Let's save this, get back to the user. You can see now the name of the user and also the profile picture. Now if I click on that, we only have the log out option. We're going to add a profile link so the user can click on that, and we're going to create a profile page later in this video, and the user will redirect to that page, and in that profile page the user can set its own profile picture. So now let's get back to the VS Code and add this link. Here inside the drop down menu, we're going to add another drop down menu item, drop down item, okay, put a link here which is actually a next link, okay, and set its href to /user/profile. Obviously we haven't created this page, but we are going to create it in the next section. And then here in the link we are going to set a caption. We're going to set the profile, okay, and then we just need to import it from the next link, okay. And then let's get back to VS Code, and if I click on that, you can see we have the profile item inside the drop down menu. So in the next section we are going to create this profile page in which the user can set its own profile picture. In this section we are going to create the profile page for our application. Here if I click on the profile panel and then click on the profile link here, we are headed to a 404 page, and that's because we haven't created the profile page yet. So now let's get back to the VS Code and create the profile page. Inside the app directory, I'm going to create a directory called user, and then inside it we're going to create another directory, profile, and then inside it we're going to create the page.tsx file. Let's create a functional component for this page, okay, and let's rename it to profile page. Okay, so now first we need to get the user from the get kind server session. So first we need to turn it to an async component, and then here we're going to call the await get kind server session, and then here from the returning object we're going to grab the get user function, and then here we need to access to our database and retrieve the user from our local database. So instead of calling the Prisma client here in the page, let's create a server action for retrieving the user from our database based on its ID. So here inside the lib directory, I'm going to create a directory called actions and then user.ts. First, we need to mark it with use server. So every function inside it now is a server action. And then here we're going to export an async function and let's name it get user by ID. And then here we're going to have an ID which is going to be string. Okay. And here we're going to call and return the find unique function from the Prisma client. So here I'm going to return await Prisma from Prisma file, which is our global Prisma client, then user, and then find unique. Okay, we're going to pass the where API. Here we're going to set the ID to the ID that we've got from the parameter. Actually, we can put the ID here inside the where object. Let's save this and get back to the profile page. And now we can use the server action. So here, first, we need to get the user from the const server session. So I'm going to say const user and set it to await get user function. So this comes from the client server session, and then here we can get the DB user, const DB user, and now we can set it to await get user by ID server action that we have just created and pass the user.id. Okay, so here the user might be undefined, so we need to check if the user is available, then send the user.id to this server action. Otherwise, just return a empty string which will result in returning a undefined DB user. So later in this video, we're going to protect this page from unauthenticated users so we can make sure that the user always will be available in this page. So now let's create the JSX. First, we need to create a page title. So I prefer to create a reusable component for the page title. Here inside the components directory of the app directory, I'm going to create a page title component.tsx. Okay, here we're going to create the components. So we are going to accept a title and a link as the props of this component, and then we can render a page title for every page inside our application. So first we need to define the interface for the props. Okay, we're going to have a title which is going to be optional and its type is string. We're going to have the href, which is actually the href of the link inside the page title. It is also going to be optional and its type is going to be string. And then we're going to have a link caption. This is going to be optional as well and its type is string. Now we can have props inside the components. Okay, and here in the root div we are going to render a h1 and just render the props.title. Okay, we will get back to this component in a second, but for now let's go to the profile page and here let's render a page title component. Okay, now we need to set the title to something like my profile. Now let's go to the browser. We have an error here, and that's because here in the profile page we have imported the getKind server session from the /dist/type. So we need to remove them from the importing path. Okay, now I think the problem should be gone, and yeah, we have the my profile here. Let's get back to the VS Code and to the page title. Let's style the page title component. First, we need to add a class name here, AP for its padding. We're going to have the gradient background. So I'm going to use the BG gradient to BR and from, I don't know, CN, for example, 400 to blue 600. Okay, and then we're going to have a flex. Okay, so let's save this, get back to the browser. Now we can see the page title. I think I misspelled the second color here. It should be blue to blue 600. Now it is much better. And now let's style the h1 element. Here in the h1, we're going to add a class name. First, we're going to set the text color to white. So I use the text white class, and then text XL for the font size, and then font medium for the font weight. Okay, get back to the browser. Now it's much better. And we are going to say that if the props.href is existed, let's turn it to a boolean and then use conditional rendering. We're going to render a link component, a next link actually, okay, and here let's put the page props.link caption, and inside the link we're going to set the href to the props.href. Okay, now let's style the link components. We're going to have the text white, and also when hover, we're going to have text CN200 and also a transition on the colors. Let's save this and let's get back to the browser. And since we haven't specified the href in the page title inside the profile page, we don't have a link component here. So actually we don't need the link component inside the profile page, but let's go with something like link caption back to home page, okay, and set its href to the home page of our application. Now let's get back here. So as you can see, the link component is below the page title. So let's get back to the page title, and here in the parent div we're going to have a flex and also justify between. Get back to browser. Now it is much better. Okay, this is for the page title. It's a reusable component and we can use it on different pages. Now let's get back to the profile page, and here we're going to use a card component that comes from the Next UI, and then here inside it we're going to render the basic information of the user. So first we need to put a section title. Since we are going to have multiple sections in this page, we're going to have a section title. I prefer to create a section title component for that. So inside the profile directory here, I'm going to create another directory called underlying components, and then here we're going to have a section title component, section title.tsx. Let's create a functional component. Okay, now we are going to create an interface for the props of the component. Name it props. It is going to have a title, which is going to be string, and then here inside it we are going to render a h1, okay, and inside it we're going to render the title. So let's get the props in the components, okay, and then here render the props.title. We need to style the h1, set the class name. First we're going to set the font size. I'm going to set it to text XL and then font bold, and for the text color I prefer to text slate 500, okay, and then we're going to have a HR element, okay, set the class name to border slate 400, and let's add some margin to the top and bottom of the component. So I'm going to add a my2, and then we're going to set the style of the border to border solid. Okay, so in this component we are actually setting a section title in the h1 and then a horizontal line. Okay, let's get back to the page.tsx. Inside the card, first we are going to have a section title, okay, it can't be found. Get back to the section title, we need to rename it, and let's change the first letter to uppercase. Okay, now let's get back to the profile page. Now we can have the section title, and we're just gonna set the title to basic information. Okay, now let's import the card from the Next UI. Okay, let's go to the browser. We have the basic information section here. We need to style the card component. So get back to VS Code, add the class name. Here we are going to put some margin M4 and also padding P4. Okay, and then get back to the VS Code again, and now we can see it is much better. So now we are going to render the basic information of the user here. Get back to VS Code, and below the section title we're going to have another div. Inside this div we are going to render the basic information of the user, and for each field of data here we can render two span elements, one for the label and the other for the data itself. So since we have multiple data here, I prefer to create a separate component for representing each data field. So here outside the page, I'm going to create another component, const attribute, and let's set it to a function and then return a div here. Okay, and inside this div, we're going to render the label and the data itself. So first we need to define the props. I'm not going to create an interface for the props type. Here we can do it inline. We can define the types of components here inside the components. So it is going to have a title, which is going to be string, and then it is going to have a value, which is going to be actually a React node. So we can pass anything we want as the value. Okay, and now we can get the title and also the value. So inside the div here, we can create two span. Okay, in the first one, we're going to render the title, and in the second one, we're going to render the value. Okay, now we are going to put some class name. In the first span element, we're going to set its text color to text slate 800 and font semi-bold. Okay, in the second one, we're going to have the text slate 600, and also we need to add some class name. In the parent div, we're going to have flex and flex col and set the font size to text SM. Okay, now we can use the attribute component for each data item inside the basic information section. So here we're going to render the first one. We set the title to name and the value to name of the user. So I put the backticks here, db user that first name space, and again db user that last name. Okay, now we can render the second attribute. So I just copy that and set it to email and just put the email of the user in the value, dbuser.email. Let's copy that. The third one is going to be date of user's registration. So I'm going to say registered on, and then here I'm going to set the dbuser.created@local date string. And for the next one, we are going to render the number of properties that the user has posted. So here I'm going to say properties posted and set the value for now to just a hard-coded value, for example 1. Later we'll get back here, and when we implement the properties section, we're going to retrieve the number of properties of the user and render it here instead of this hard-coded value. Okay, so let's get back to the browser. Now we can see we have the information here. So let's put him in a grid system. Get back to VS Code. In this parent div of the attributes, we're going to set the class name. We're going to use a grid system, grid goals 1, and on the MD screens and above, we're going to use grid goals 2, and on the LG screen and above, let's have 3 columns. So I'm going to set grid goals 3. Okay, and also we need to have a gap, for example 4. Now let's get back to browser, and I think it is much better. Okay, in this section we are going to create a avatar section or profile picture section. So here in the basic information section, I'm going to create a div here, and inside it we're going to put an avatar component that comes from the Next UI. We're going to set its src to user, and in case of it's undefined, we can use the default profile.png, which is in the public directory of this project. So let's get to the browser. You can see the profile picture here, and we're going to set a class name. I'm going to use W20 for its width and also H20 for its height, and now it's a little bigger. And now we are going to put a functionality for uploading a new profile picture for the user. So I'm going to get back to the VS Code, and here I'm going to create a component called upload avatar in the user profile. So here I'm going to create an upload avatar.tsx. Okay, create a functional component here. It should be a client component, so I mark it with the use client, and then here we need to render a button. So inside the main div here, we're going to use a button, just a plain HTML button, and then inside it we're going to have a pencil icon from the hero icons. So pencil icon. Okay, let's set the class name W6 for its width and text slate 400 for its color, and on hover you're going to change its color to text primary, and we're gonna have a transition on its color. Okay, so we're not done yet with this component, but let's put it here in the profile page, and below the avatar we're gonna render a upload avatar button. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see we have this pencil here. Let's get it to the page and set the class name for the container div, flex and flex col, and also items center. Now let's get back to the browser. You can see we have the profile icon. So let's push it here in the left side of the page. Use justify start, and we're going to put it inside another div here. Okay, and let's set the class name of the parent div to flex. Now it is on the left side of the page. Okay, now let's go back to the upload avatar component, and here we are going to use a modal component from the Next UI. So when the user click on this button, the pencil button, the upload avatar modal is opened, and we can upload the profile picture inside that modal. So I go to the Next UI, and here scroll down for the modal component. Modal, it's here. Let's change. I think it's okay. So let's copy the code here. First we need to use this state, use this closure for managing the open and closing state of the modal. So let's paste it here in the upload avatar, and let's import it. Get back to the Next UI. Let's copy the modal component here and paste it after the button. Okay, now let's import all the missing imports. Okay, so in the modal title, we're going to put the upload avatar text for the header of the modal, and inside the modal body, we don't need this dummy p tags, and here we need to put a file input inside the modal body. So for the upload file, I just paste a pre-built component that I've written with the Tailwind CSS. This is just a component that I have written with Tailwind CSS. It's a label component and also basic HTML input component with its types is set to file. There's just some bunch of Tailwind CSS classes to style this component. So to speed up the process, I just skip the designing this file input. I push it into the GitHub repository of this tutorial. You can use it if you want. So let's get back to the upload avatar, and we can use this file input component. So first we need to create a use state for the selected image by the user. So I'm going to say const image and set image and set it to use state and set its type to file. Okay, now we can use our file input in the modal body. So here I'm going to use file input, and on the onChange props event we can get the e parameter, and here inside the onChange function we can set the image with the e.target.files. So first we need to cast the e as any, and then call the target.files, and then grab the first one, and then after the file input we can render the selected image by the user. So here first we're going to check if the image is not undefined, then we can render the image element, okay, and set its src to the selected image by the user. So we can't directly set the src of image of the selected file, so we need to use the URL class here and call the create object URL and just pass the image file. Okay, now in the modal footer we can have the cancel button as well as the change avatar button. So first we're going to change the caption of the primary button to change avatar, and then change the cancel button to just cancel, and then we are going to set the onClick event of the pencil button to the onOpen function that comes from the use disclosure. So here onClick, set it to onOpen. So the Next UI use disclosure will handle the opening and closing state of the modal component for us. So let's save this and get back to the browser. Here if I click on the pencil button and click on the upload file, and here for example let's choose this image, and here if I click on the change avatar, nothing happens because we haven't implemented the file upload mechanism for our application. So in the next section we are going to set up the Supabase buckets for implementing the file upload mechanism. In this section we are going to use Supabase for implementing the file upload in our application. So here I'm in the supabase.com, and here first you need to sign in into the Supabase, and then you can click on the start your project. You can click in the new organization here. I've already have an organization here, which is really easy. You just need to put the name of your organization, and then here after that we can click on the new project to create a new project. Put the name of the project. Okay, we're gonna have SK real estate clone. Okay, now click on the create a new project. Now you can see we have the SK real estate clone. So if I click on that, here I go to the home page of the project. I click on the connect here, and here let's choose the app framework and select the framework with the Next.js and also using the app router. And we just need to copy these env variables and get back to our project, and here go to the env file and just paste them here inside this env file. So now let's create a section for that, Supabase. Okay, put them here. And now we can install the Supabase in our Next.js application and then create a Supabase client. And then we can use that for uploading the images into the Supabase buckets. So we haven't created the Supabase buckets. So let's get back to the Supabase section and let's close this off. Go to the storage section here, create a new bucket here. Let's change it to public bucket. Okay, and let's set the name of the bucket to avatars. Okay, and click on the save here. It creates the avatars bucket for us. It's just like a folder inside the Supabase storage. So now let's get back to the VS Code, and here let's open up the terminal. Let's clear this up, and now we can use npm I and then add supabase/supabase.js. We're going to install that in our project. Okay, now we can go to the lib directory and create a TypeScript file for uploading the images. So I'm going to name it upload.ts. It's not a server action. It's very important. Okay, so here we're going to export a function, export async function. I'm going to name it upload avatar, and then it is going to take an image which its type is going to be type file. Okay, and then let's define the body of the function. First, we need to retrieve the Supabase URL and Supabase key from the env file, and those two variables that we have just created for the Supabase section. Okay, now we can create a Supabase client here. So I'm going to say const Supabase and then use the create client that comes from the Supabase and just pass the Supabase URL and then Supabase key. Okay, now we can upload the image into the Supabase buckets. So I'm going to say const data equals to await and then call the Supabase dot storage dot from name of the bucket, which is going to be avatars. Okay, and then dot upload, and then we can put a name for our image inside the bucket. So let's create a backtext here. I'm going to put the image dot name and then a underscore and put the date dot now function. So it will actually guarantee that the name of the file will not be duplicated. And then after that, we are going to put the actual image file. So with this one line of code, we can upload our image file into the avatars bucket from the Supabase storage. That is really easy. And then here we're going to return the public URL of the uploaded image. So every time that we need to show the image, we can just set the src props of the image component to this URL string. So here I'm going to say const URL and set it to await Supabase storage from, again, name of the bucket, which is avatars, and then call the get public URL and pass the data that we've got from the storage upload here, data, and then path. And here we just put a exclamation mark. And let's change the name here to URL data because it is not actually the plain URL. It's an object that public URL is inside it. Then we can return the URL data object .data.public URL. So this will return the public URL of the uploaded image to the Supabase buckets. So let's save this, and then we need to create a server action for updating the avatar URL of the user. So here in the server actions and the user.ts file, we need to create another server action. I'm going to say export async function and name it update user avatar. Okay, we're going to take the avatar URL, which is going to be a string, and the user ID, which is also going to be a string. Okay, now let's go for the body of the function. We're going to return and then await, call the Prisma client .user .update function. First, we need to specify which user we want to update. So I use the where API here and set the ID to the user ID parameter. Okay, and then here we need to specify the data that we want to update. So we're going to set the data API here, and inside it we're going to update the avatar URL to the avatar URL that we've got from the parameters. Okay, so this will update the avatar URL of the user. Now we need to go back to the upload avatar component here inside the change avatar button, and on the onPress function we need to create a function here and call it. Okay, first we need to change the state of the button to a loading state, so we need to create a state for is loading. I'm going to say const, or better to say, let's set it is submitting, and also set is submitting. Okay, I think I misspell here the submit. Now it's okay. Let's set it to a use state. It is going to be a boolean, so let's just initialize it with the false. Okay, get back to the change avatar button, and here in the button we can specify is loading prop and set it to is submitting state. So if it is true, the button will show a loader spinner. This is the Next UI button, so it's a built-in functionality of that. Okay, and then here inside the onPress function, first we need to set the is submitting to true. Okay, and then we're going to say if not image, which means that if the image is undefined, call the onClose function, so it will close the modal. And actually let's put a block here, because after the onClose we want to just return the function. After that we're going to upload the avatar, so here I'm going to say const avatar URL. Let's set it to await upload avatar function that comes from the upload.ts file that we have just created in the lib directory, and then pass the image file. Okay, we can't use the await keyword here, so I'm going to change the function to an async function. The error is gone, and then after uploading the avatar we need to update the user table. So here we'll say const result and use the await and call the update user avatar server action, pass the avatar URL, and also pass the user ID. So we don't have the user ID, we need to get it from the props of the component. So here inside the props section, first we're going to have an inline type for the props. It should have user ID inside it, which is going to be string, and then we can grab the user ID from the props and get back to the change avatar button and pass the user ID props. Now we need to soft refresh the page, so we're going to use the use router here from the Next.js. So I'm going to say const router and set it to use router that comes from the next/navigation. Okay, get back to the change avatar button, and after updating the user avatar, I'm going to use the router and call the refresh function. It will soft refresh the page without actually refreshing the page. So last thing we need to do is to set is submitting to false. Okay, so it will hide the loader spinner of the button, and we just call the onClose function. Okay, now let's get back to the page.tsx, our profile page, and pass the user ID. So I'm going to specify the user ID here and set it to dbuser.id. Also put an exclamation mark here to assert that this ID is not going to be undefined. Now if I go back to the browser and our application, let's change the upload image. Okay, it doesn't change the profile picture. Let's go to the VS Code and go to the upload.ts file, and here let's log the data, so it's return object of the upload file. Here let's change the avatar, open up the console, and here we have an error, and that's because of the row level security policy of the Supabase. So we need to fix that inside our Supabase project. I go to the Supabase and go to the dashboard and go to my project. Here I go to the SQL editor, and here we need to create a SQL script for disabling the row level security on the storage object. So here I'm going to say alter table storage.objects and say disable row level security. Okay, now let's run this script. As you can see, it succeeds, and I go back to my application and let's open up the upload avatar and click on the change avatar here. And yeah, we don't have any error, and you can see the profile picture of the user is now changed without any error. And that's it for this section. Later in the upcoming sections, we are going to add another section here for the user subscription plan. And now we can move forward to the next section. In this section, we are going to protect our pages from unauthenticated user with our authentication system KindAuth. So here, as you can see, I'm authenticated in the application. So now let's log out from the application. And here, if I manually go to the user profile, you can see I can go to the profile page, although I'm not authenticated. So in order to protect the pages from the unauthenticated users, we have two ways here. One way is using the isAuthenticated function from the getKind server session. So we can check if the isAuthenticated function returns false. We can redirect the user to the sign-in page. But we need to do this on every page that we are going to protect. The other way, which I really prefer, is using the middleware. So I go to the KindAuth documentation, and here let's go to the docs. Let's choose the Next.js and scroll down here, protecting routes. And as you can see, it is showing that we can protect the users with the isAuthenticated function, but we are going to protect the pages with the middleware. So I copy this code here, which is for protecting the pages with the middleware, and get back to the VS Code. And here inside the src directory and side by side of the app directory, I'm going to create a middleware file. So here I'm going to say middleware.ts, okay, and here just copy the code, and we just need to set the type of this request to any, okay. And here in the matcher, we can define the pages that we are going to protect from the unauthenticated user. So in our case, the page is user/profile. Okay, that is all we need to do inside the middleware. Now I go back to the browser, and here you can see I'm not signed in. So if I try to refresh the page, you can see we are automatically redirected to the sign-in page of the KindAuth. So now let's again sign in with my Google account. Okay, choose my email account here. Okay, now I'm signed in, and if I go to the profile page, now we can go to the profile page, and that's because I'm now signed in into our application. So in this way, we can easily protect our pages in our Next.js project with KindAuth. And now we can move on to the next section, which we are going to create the user properties page. In this section, we are going to create the user properties page. So here we are going to add a properties menu item on the user profile panel. So if we click on that, we are headed to the user properties page. In this page, first we are going to create the add property page. So if we click on this button here, we are headed to the add properties page for the current user, in which the user can post a new property. Then we are going to create this user properties table, that each row of this table represents a property that has been posted by the current user in our application. Also, we're going to have a pagination panel and paginate the data that we are going to show in this table. And then for each property, we have three options here. We're going to have the details page, in which we have all the data about the selected property. And then if I go back to the user properties, also we have the edit property option for each property. So in this section, we can update the data about each property. Okay, and then here we have the delete property option, and with that we can delete the selected property. So now in the first step here, we are going to create the add property page. In this section, we are going to create the add property page. So here, as you can see, we are going to create a 5-step form in this page. And here in the first step, we are going to add the basic information about the property. So let me quickly fill up the form with the dummy data here. And let's go to the next step. Okay, as you can see, we're going to have data validation on each step. And here I'm going to go to the next section. You can see nice animation here. And here I'm going to quickly add some dummy data about the location of the property. And go to the next section. We can go back to the previous section if you want, but here if we don't fill up the required field inside the current step, we can't move forward to the next step. You can see we have data validation on each step. So let me quickly fill up the form with some dummy data. Okay, and here in this step, we can upload the images about the property. So we just select this one and this one. Okay, also we can delete each one. Let's add another one. Okay, now let's go to the last section, and again here let me quickly fill up the form with some dummy data here. And now if I click on the save here, you can see the added toast on the screen, which means that the property has been inserted into our database. So now, without any extra explanation, let's create this form. Okay, so here inside the app directory and then in the user directory and side by side of the profile directory, we're going to create another route for the properties. So here inside the user directory, I'm going to create a directory called properties. Okay, and then here inside it, we're going to define the page.tsx. Okay, this is the properties page. So here I'm going to create a functional component for this page. Let's rename it to properties page. Okay, so let's save this. And now let's go to the user profile panel. Inside the components directory in the app directory, we're going to go to the user profile panel, and here after the profile link, we're going to define a new drop down item for the properties link. So here let's copy that and here paste it. Inside it, as you can see, we have a next link. So we're going to change its href to user/properties. Okay, and then let's change the caption to properties. Okay, so now let's get to the browser, and here, as you can see, we have a properties page. So here, let's go to the properties page. Okay, here is the properties page. So now let's get back to the VS Code and create a layout for this route. So inside the properties route, I'm going to create a layout.tsx file, layout.tsx, and here let's create a functional component. I'm going to name it properties layout. Okay, now let's define an interface for the props of this layout. I'm going to say interface. Okay, and then props. Inside it, we're going to have children, which is going to be React Node. Okay, now let's get the children here in the prop section of this layout. So here, first, we're going to set the type of the props to the props interface that we have just created. And then we just grab the children out of it. Here inside it, let's render the children in the main div. And now let's define a page title section for this layout. So above the children, define another div. Inside it, we're going to have an h2 in which I'm going to write user properties. Okay, now after the h2, we're going to have a button which comes from the Next UI, and here inside the button, we're going to say add property. So this button actually will redirect us to the add property page. So let's save this and let's go to the browser. You can see we have the user properties. I have a typo here. We need to fix that. And then we have the add property button. So let's style this panel. Okay, here in the div that contains the h2 and the button, we're going to add some Tailwind CSS classes. First, we need to set the background to BG primary 400. Okay, and then we're going to have the flex because we want the h2 and this button be positioned side by side, and then we're going to push them to the edges of this panel. So I use the justify between, which puts the h2 in the left hand side and put the button on the right hand side of this panel. Also, we need to add the item center, so we're going to align them center vertically, and a p2 for padding in this panel. So let's save this now, get back to the browser. You can see now it's looking better. Now let's style the h2. First, let me fix the typo here. Okay, now class name here in the h2. First, we're going to set the text color to text white. Okay, and then let's go for the font size. I'm going to go ahead with the text XL. And for the font weight, I choose the font semi-bold. Okay, and we just need some padding on the x-axis of this h2. So I use px2. And then here, let's go and style the button. We're going to set the color props to secondary. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. It's looking much better now. Okay, now let's create the add property page. So here inside the properties, I'm going to create a add directory, and inside it, we're going to add the page.tsx. Okay, so for now, let's create a simple page here. Let's name it add property page. Okay, let's save this and get back to the properties layout. And here inside this button, let's actually render a link for redirecting the user to the add property page. So here I'm going to add a Next.js link. So I put a link here, and let's move the add property text inside the link component. And then we need to set the href to /user/properties. and then /add. And here we just need to import the link from the next/link. Okay, now let's go to the browser. If I click on the add property, it actually redirects us to a page that doesn't exist, and that's because we have a typo here on the add page route. So let's get back to the browser, and here actually we need to fix the typo here. Get back to the browser, and now let's click on the add property. You can see here we are on the add property page, and here is the add properties text. So now we are going to create a form component and put it here in the add property page. Okay, so I get back to the VS Code, and here inside the add directory, I'm going to create a components directory. So inside this directory, we are going to put our components that are related to the add property page. So let's create a add property form inside it, add property form.tsx. Okay, and here let's create the components. And here in this form, the first component that we are going to create is the stepper component. So here I'm talking about this stepper component. So now let's create this stepper component and then put it on the add property page. In this section, we are going to create the stepper component. So I go to the components directory inside the add directory. I'm going to create a component here and name it stepper.tsx. And here in this file, let's create a functional component. So first, we need to define the interface or the props of this component. I'm going to create an interface here, name it props. Okay, now in the props of this component, we need 4 props. The first one is the list of the stepper items. So here we're going to define the items here, and it's going to be type of an object which contains a label inside it, and each label is type of string. Okay, and then we're going to have a list of these objects. Then we're going to have the active item, which is actually the index of the active item. So it is going to be a number, and then we're going to have a set active item, which is actually going to be a function. So here it is going to take the index of the active item. So the index is going to be a number, and it returns nothing. Okay, and then it is going to have a optional class name. So we're going to define a class name prop, and its type is going to be type of string. Okay, so that is the interface for the props of the component, and now we can access them inside the prop section of the component. So first we are going to set the type of the props to props interface, and then we can extract them here from the props, or we can just have a props object here in the props of the component. And then here inside the JSX, in the first step, we need to render the item. So here I'm going to map through the props.items. Okay, and here call the map function. We're going to have the item here, and also we need to access to the index of the current item. And then here we're going to render a div here. Okay, and here inside the div we're going to render the index of the item. So here we're going to have the index +1. Okay, and then below the div we need to render the label of the item. So I'm going to use a p tag here, and inside this p tag we're going to render the item.label. And then in order to get rid of this error here, we need to wrap them inside a React fragment. Okay, so that will fix the problem here. And we're not done yet here. We still need to style the component. But for now, let's go to the add property form here and use the stepper component here. So first we need to define the steps here. Here I'm going to define a list here. I'm going to name it steps and set it to a list. Okay, and inside this list we're going to have the items or steps. In each one we're going to have a label. Okay, the first one is going to be basic, and we're going to have the second one. So let's just copy that and paste it here. We just need to rename the label here. I'm going to set it to location. Okay, and then here just paste the next one is going to be features, and the next one is going to be pictures. Okay, and the last one is going to be contact. Now that we have the steps list here, we can put the stepper function inside the add property form. So in the main div here, we're going to render the stepper here. Okay, we need to define the items. So we're going to set the items to steps list that we have just created. And then in order to keep the current step, we need to define a state here for the current step. So here we're going to use a useState here, const step and set step. We're going to set it to useState, and the initial value is going to be 0. Now we can set the active item to step state that we have just created and set active item to the set step that we have just created. Okay, we have an error here on the items. I think we just misspelled the type of the items inside the interface props of the stepper component. So let's go to the stepper component. Here we need to fix the typo here, and yeah, the error is gone. So here we just need to fix the typo in the stepper component and the error is gone. So now we need to go to the add property page, and then here we just need to render the add property form. So I'm going to say add property form, and let's save this. And also we need to mark the add property form with use client. Now let's go to the browser. So I go to the properties page and then click on the add property. You can see here we have the stepper items plainly rendered in the add property form. So now let's get back to the VS Code and start styling the stepper component. So I go to the stepper component. First we need to put the items side by side. So here inside the parent div, we're going to add a class name, and let's set it to the CN function. Okay, let's put our class name. We're going to have the flex, also item center to line them vertically, and justify around to distribute them horizontally in the screen. And then here we need to pass the props.class name. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see the items now are side by side, and then we need to style each item. So get back to the VS Code, and here for each item in the first div, which renders the number or index of the item, we need to add a class name. Okay, again we're going to use the CN function, and here we're going to make it a circle. So I use the rounded full here. Okay, and then we're going to set the width and height of this circle, and then we are going to put the index exactly on the center of this div. So I use flex here and justify center and item center. Okay, and then we're going to need a transition for some transition when the color of this circle changes. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. So since it doesn't have a background color yet, we can't see that it is now a circle. So let's get back to the VS Code here, but here we need to set the background color of each item conditionally based on if it is a active item or not. So here inside the CN function, we can easily put some conditional classes. So as a second argument of the CN function, we're going to have an object here, and we're going to set the background color to BG primary 400 and text white if the index of this item equals to active item. It means that this item is the active item. So here as the condition inside this conditional object of the CN function, we're going to put the condition here. We're going to say if index equals to props that active item. Okay, and then if the index is greater than the active item, it means that the current active item has not reached to this item. So we need to make the background color of this item to a gray color. So here add another conditional class. We're going to have the BG gray 400 and also text white if the index is greater than the props that active item. Okay, and if the index is less than the active item, it means that this item has been completed. So we need to set the background color of this item accordingly. So here in this case, we are going to set the BG color to primary 700 and also a text white. We can just take the text white out of this conditional object, but just let's keep it here. And as the condition, we're going to say that if the index is less than the props that active item, just activate these classes. And finally, we are going to set the cursor pointer of this div to cursor pointer if the index is less or equal to the active item. It means that we can't activate the items that has been not completed yet directly by clicking on the items. I will show you exactly what I mean in a second in the browser. So here we just need to add the cursor pointer if the index is less than or equals to the active item. So here I'm going to say props.active item. So this is the class name of this stepper. So now let's go back to the browser. Now you can see the first one, which is the current or active step, is set to blue color are BG primary, and the next ones, all of them are set to BG gray 400. You can see when we hover on the active item, the cursor is turned to a pointer, but in the next one, which has not been activated yet, the cursor is not turned to a pointer. And now let's get back to the VS Code here, and here after the class name, we need to set the onClick here. So I'm going to set the onClick props of this div and set it to a function which calls the props.setActiveItem, and then we just pass the index of the item. So it will actually change the current step to this item. And now let's go back to the browser. You can see if I click on this, here the step changes, and if I click on each item that has not been completed, the current step is also changed. We don't want that. We want to activate the onClick props for the items or steps that have been completed. Okay, so this is okay to click on the third step here and activate it, but we don't want the user be able to click on the steps that have not been activated yet. So here, let's get back to the VS Code, and here we need to set the onClick event conditionally if the index is less than the active item. Okay, so here we're going to conditionally render set the onClick event. Here we are going to put a curly braces here and then put a parenthesis, and here first we are going to put our condition if the index is less than the props that active item. So here, if this condition is true, we need to render an object that contains the onClick function inside it. So here first we're going to render an object, and then here we need to cut this onClick props from that and then paste it here, and just we need to change the assignment to a colon, and also we don't need the curly braces here. Okay, so the object contains an onClick function which calls the props.setActivateItem. And then if this condition is not true, we're going to just render a empty object. Okay, and here we need to spread the final object, and I think we have a extra curly braces here, and yeah, this is working without any errors. So here we are actually adding the onClick event to this div only if the index is less than props.activeItem. Okay, so now let's get back to the browser. Now you can see if I click on the step that is not activated yet, the current step will not change. But if we click on this item which already has been completed, you can see the current step is now changed. Okay, and as the next step, we need to put the label of each step below its circle. Okay, so let's get back to the VS Code, and here we need to wrap this div and p element inside a parent div. So here I'm going to create a div and wrap these two elements with this new div. Okay, now we can set the class name of the parent div here. We're going to have flex and flex curl. Also, we need to set the items center. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. Okay, labels are now below the circles. And now in the next step, we need to put a line between these steps. So I get back to the VS Code, and after the parent div for each item, we're going to create a line. And since we don't want the line after the last step, we are going to put the lines here conditionally. So here I open up a curly braces and say if the index of the item is not equals to props.items.length -1, then put a line here. So use the logical AND operator and then put a div here which represents a line. And here we need to set the class name for this div. Actually, this div, as I said, will represent a line. So the first class we should add to this div is the border. And then we're going to have the h0 because we don't want it to have any height. Okay, we want it to be just a line. And also we're going to have the W full because we want it to have the maximum available width. Okay, and now let's go back to the browser. You can see we have a line between these steps now. So let's align this line with the center of the circles. Get back to the VS Code, and here we just need to add a negative margin from the top. So I use -mt and then something like 5. Let's save this, get back to the browser. You can see now the line aligned with the center of the circles. And as a last thing here, we want to color the line if its step has been completed. So a simple way to do that is just set the border color of this div if the index is less than active item. But here we want to add some nice animation when the step is completed, so we don't actually color the line itself, but here we want to drag a line from left to right exactly on the line itself. So we're going to use the after pseudo element of this div. First, we need to set the position of this div to relative, okay, and then set the position of the after pseudo element to absolute. So use after and then colon absolute. Okay, we need to put exactly the after pseudo element on each line. So I use after and then set the left 0 and again after and top 0. Okay, we're going to set the after column border. So in this way we are setting the border of the after pseudo element, and then here we're going to set the transition class for the after pseudo element. So I use after colon transition all, and then set the transition duration for the after pseudo element, after duration 300, and after is in for performing the transition. Okay, now we are going to set some class conditionally for the after pseudo element. If the index is less than active item, which means that it has been completed already, we're going to set the width of this after pseudo element to w full and set its border color to primary 400. So here we're going to use the cn function and put the class names inside a curly braces and call the cn function, put the class names here inside the parameters of the cn function, and now as the second argument, we're going to have our conditional object for conditional classes. The first conditional class is after w full and after border primary 400 for its border color. And we're going to activate this class only if the index of the current item is less than the props.active item. Okay, and then we're going to have our second conditional class. We're going to set the width of the after to w0 only if the index the current item is greater or equals to the props.active item. Let's save this now and get back to the browser. You can see when the count step change, we have nice animation of filling the color of the step lines. So now for transitioning to the next step, we're going to have a dummy button here on the form. So I go to the add property form here, and after this stepper, we're going to have a dummy button. We're going to remove it. It's just for testing the transition to the next item. And here I'm going to say just next item. Okay, and on its on click, we're going to call the set step here and pass a callback here, Prev, and return the Prev plus 1. So as you know, it actually increment the step state. Let's get to the browser. Here's the button. If I click on that, you can see the after pseudo element is sliding through its line. Okay, let's get back to the previous steps and let's go to the next step. You can see it is working smoothly. So yeah, that's it for the stepper component. Let's just remove this next item button. It was just for testing, and now we can move to the next section in which we are going to put the form elements on our add property form. In this section of this tutorial, we are going to create the basic step part of the add property form. So we are going to add a name, description, type, status, and a price input in our add property form. Before creating this part of the form, we're going to add the property type model and also the property status model in our prisma.schema file. So now let's get right into it. Back to the VS Code, I go to the Prisma directory and schema.prisma file, and then here we need to create the property model and also the property type and property status model. So first, let's create the property model. So here I'm going to say model property. It is going to have an ID and its type is going to be int, and it is going to be at ID, which means that it is the primary key of the table, and set the default decorator, okay, and call the auto increment function. So the ID will be an auto increment primary key. It means that we don't need to initialize the ID field when we are going to insert some data into the property table. It will initialize by the database management system itself. Okay, so the second field is going to be name of the property. It is going to be string, and we're going to have a description. Also, it is going to be string, and then it is going to have price, which is going to be int, and now we need to create a relationship between the user and the property. So in order to understand the type of the relationship between the user model and the property model, let's go to the schema diagram, and I'm going to create the relation between these two tables visually so you can understand the relation between these two tables. Okay, back to the browser, and here as you can see we have already created the user table. So now let's create the property table first. Here just quickly create the property table, and let's set an icon. I'm gonna go with the home icon. Okay, and then it has ID, which is int. Okay, it's a primary key of the table, and name, which is string. Okay, description, it is string as well. Okay, and then we have the price of the property, which is going to be int. Okay, now let's talk about the relationship between the user and property table. So each user in our system can have multiple properties, but each property can only belongs to just one user. So this is going to be a one-to-many relationship between the user and property. And in order to implement this type of relationship between the property and the user table, we are going to insert a user ID field in the property table. So a rule of thumb here is that if we have one-to-many relationship between the user and property table, so the one side of the relationship is the user table and the many side of the relationship is the property table. So we need to add the ID of the one side inside the many side of our relationship. So here we're going to add a user ID here, user ID in the property model, which is the many side of our one-to-many relationship, and it is going to actually be a foreign key to the users table. We need to set the type of the user ID table exactly with the same as the type of the user.id field. So as you can see, the ID inside the user is string, so we need to set the type of this user ID in the property model to string as well. Okay, so we're not done yet. We need to set up the relationship between these two tables. So a one-to-many relationship can be seen as a many-to-one relationship. So we have a one-to-many relationship between the user to property, or we have a many-to-one relationship from the property to user table. So here in this diagram tool, we can also define the relationships between the tables. So here after the property table, I'm going to define the relationship between these two tables. So here I'm going to say property dot user ID, and then here this diagram tool opens up a drop down menu which offers the type of the relationships. As I said, from property to user we have a many-to-one relationship, so I'm going to choose the many-to-one here. Okay, and then I'm going to choose the other side of the relationship, which is the user, and inside the user, property.id refers to the user.id. So here as you can see, it promptly creates the relationship between the user and property table. You can see the position of these two tables is changed, and here we have a one-to-many relationship between the user and table. And as you can see here, the one side of the relationship is the user table and the many side of the relationship is the property table. As I said, this type of relationship means that one user can have multiple properties, but each property can only belong to just one user. So let's go back to the VS Code and implement this relationship in our Prisma.schema file. So back to VS Code, here in the property model, as you saw in the diagram, we need to add a user ID here. User ID, our foreign key to the user table. It is going to be string because here user.id is also type of string. So we need to type them to the same type. Okay, so let's save this. Now we need to implement the relationship between the tables. We haven't actually created the relationship between these two tables. So in order to do that, we need to add a user field here, user, and let's set its type to user model. Okay, as I save this, it quickly creates the relationship between the user and property table. It uses the relations decorator and specify the fields here, the user ID, and it says that the field's user ID will refer to the ID field of the user table, this field here. Okay, so here, as you can see, it also creates a property field, which is type of a list of properties. So each user now can have multiple properties. This field is created by the schema itself. I just save the file and Prisma will handle that. Okay, so as you can see, we can easily create the relationships between the models in Prisma. Okay, and here keep in mind that as we move on through this tutorial, we will add more fields to the property table. But for now, it is enough. And now let's create the property type model. So here, let's scroll down and I'm going to say model property type. It is going to have an ID, which is type of int, and it is the primary key of the table. Let's have a default value and call the increment function inside the default decorator. Then we're going to have the value, which is going to be string. Okay. And now we need to set up the relationship between the property model and property type model. So let's go back to our diagram. And here, let's quickly add the property type model. Property type, it is going to have an ID, which is type of int. It is going to be primary key and also a value, which is type of string. Now, here we need to set up the relationship between the property and property type. Again, here, each property can have one type, but each property type can belong to multiple properties. So again, this is going to be a one-to-many relationship from the property type to property, or many-to-one relationship from the property to property type. So here in the property model, let's add a type ID field, which is going to refer to the ID inside the property type. And let's set its data type to int. Okay, now we can see the type ID here inside the property table. Now let's define the relationship. We're going to say that property dot type ID and then choose the many-to-one relation and define the other side of the relationship, which is the property type. And here property.type ID refers to the property type.id. Okay, as you can see here, now we have a one-to-many relationship from the property type to the property table. Awesome. Now let's go to the Prisma.schema file and implement this relationship as well. Get back to VS Code. Here in the property table, we're going to have a type ID and it is going to be int, and then we're going to have a type, okay, which its type is going to be property type. So as soon as I save this file, you can see, let's close this Explorer to have more room here. You can see it uses the @relation decorator and says the field property type. Actually, it creates a property type ID itself. So we don't need that. We're gonna remove that. And here, let's specify the type ID. So we are saying that the field type ID in the property table, this field will refer to the ID of the property type table. And you can see here, it also creates a property field inside the property type model. We use the words model and table interchangeably in the Prisma. Okay, so don't confuse that. They are the same. You can see the property type table can belong to multiple property, but here for each property, we can only have one type ID. This is the one-to-many relationship from the property type to the property table. One type of the property type can belong to multiple property. Okay, now we need to create the other model, which is the property status. So let's create the property status here, model property status. It's also going to have an ID. We can just copy this section here and paste it here. So it has an ID, which is going to be a type of int and a value, which is going to be string. The ID is the primary key of the table and it has the default value of the increment function. So it's a increment primary key. The type of the relationship between the property status and property table is the same as the property type. Each property can have one property status, but each property status can belong to multiple property. So it is going to be a one-to-many relationship from the property status to property table. Let's go back to the diagram tool and let's create the property status here. Just copy that and let's paste it here. Just rename it to the property status. Okay, now let's create the relationship here. So this is the property status table, and then we need to add a property status ID inside the property table. So we're just going to say status ID, which is going to be int. Okay, now we can create the relationship between these two tables. We're going to say property dot status ID is going to have a many-to-one relationship. Don't confuse between the one-to-many relationship and many-to-one relationship. These two are the same. We just need to make it upside down. It is the same. So from the property to status table, we have a many-to-one relationship. So let's choose the many to one here, and choose the property status on the other side of the relationship. And we're going to say that this status ID of the property model will refer to the ID of the property status table. So here, as you can see, again, we have a one-to-many relationship from the property status to property, or a many-to-one relationship from the property table to property status. Multiple properties can have one property status, but each property status can belong to multiple properties. So it's a one-to-many relationship from the property status to the property table. Okay, now let's go back to the Prisma.schema here and go to the property table and add a status ID. It is going to be type of the int, and now we can have the status here, which is going to be type of the property status. So since we didn't save this file, it doesn't show the property status in the autocomplete. So let's save this, and now we can access to the property status here, and we just need to save this, and it again creates the property status ID. We don't need this field, just change the fields here to the status ID. So again, we are saying that the field status ID in the property table, this field will refer to the ID table of the property status. Okay, so this is the many-to-one relationship from the property table to the property status table, or one-to-many relationship from the property status table to property table. So for now, we're done with this schema file. We're going to have more models and more relationships between these models in the upcoming section of this tutorial. So for now, let's save this, and we're going to need to run a migration here. So let's first clear this up. So I'm going to say npx prisma migrate dev -- name. Let's say, for example, adding type and status. Okay, it is done. So now let's go to the Prisma Studio, npx Prisma Studio. Now we can see we have the property type and property status table. So here I go to the property status here, and let's add some records here. The first one for the status is going to be, for example, sold. Here, let's change it to the uppercase, sold. Okay, the second one is going to be for sale, and the third one is going to be, for example, under contract. Just some dummy data for the property status. Let's save this, and let's go to the property type here, and let's add some dummy value into our this table. The first type is going to be condo, the second one is going to be apartment, for example, and the third one is going to be villa. Okay, let's save this, and now we can go ahead and create the first step of our add property form. Okay, now let's go to the components directory for the add property form here. You can see we have the stepper here, add property form, and here let's go and create a basic.tsx file, basic.tsx. Okay, so in this file we are going to create basic step part of our add property form. So let's create a functional component. Okay, I'm gonna call it basic. Okay, now let's define an interface for this component, interface props, and here first we need the class name. It is going to be optional, and its type is going to be string. Then we're going to have the types here, which is actually the property types. So we need to set its type to property type class, which comes from the Prisma client, and then we're going to have a list of them. Okay, in the same way we can have the status. So here we're going to have a status says, for example, because it's going to be a list of property status. So we're going to set its type to property status, which comes from the Prisma/client. Okay, then we're going to have a list of them. So here let's define the props and set its type to props interface that we have just created. Okay, now let's go to the add property form here, and after the stepper we're going to have a form, and we don't want the action here, and inside this form we're going to render the basic component that we have just created. Let's import that, and then here we need to set the statuses and types. So we need to retrieve the property statuses and property types from our database and then pass them to the basic component. And since this is a client component, we can't access directly to the Prisma. So we need to go to the add property page here. You can see it's a server component, and then here we need to retrieve the property types and property statuses and then pass them to the add property form. And here we need to use prisma.propertytype.findMany and prisma.propertystatus.findMany. We need to run two promises. So it is best to use the promise.all here to run these two promises simultaneously. Okay, so here I'm going to define the property types and property statuses inside a list here. So we're going to have property types and property statuses, and then use the promise.all function. So here I'm going to use await and then promise.all. In this all function, we need to pass our promises. The first one, it is going to return the property types, and the second one is going to return the property statuses here. So let's create them directly inside the promise.all here. Let's pass a list here, and in the first element, we're going to say Prisma.property type.find many. So it will return all the property types, and in the second element, we're going to say Prisma.property status.find many. So here notice that we don't use the await before these two functions. We just use the await before the promise.all. And then we have an error here for the await because we need to turn this component to an async component. Okay, so in this way we can actually simultaneously retrieve the property types and property statuses, and then we need to pass them to the add property form. So I go to the add property form, and let's define an interface for this add property form which has the types and statuses. So here I'm defining the interface props. It is going to have the types, which is going to be a list of property type, and we're going to have a statuses here, which is a list of the property status. Okay, now let's go to the components here and take the props, set the type of the props to props interface that we have just created. And now let's go back to the page here. You can see we have an error now. We need to set the types to the property types and statuses to the property statuses. So we retrieve the property types here and property statuses here. Okay, now let's save this and go to the add property form. In the same way, we can pass the types and property statuses to the basic component. So I'm going to specify the types here and set it to props.types, and then specify the statuses and set it to props.statuses. Okay, now the all errors are gone. So now we have the types and statuses in the basic component. We can go to the basic component and put the for element here. So we already have put the basic component in the add property form. So if I go to the browser, you can see this second basic is our basic component. The first one is the label of the first step, and the second one is the basic component. So now let's go to the final version of the form. You can see we need to add name, description, type, status, and a price. So now let's put them on the basic component. Okay, so I go back to the browser, and here in the basic component, first I'm going to change the div here to a cart component from the Next UI. Get back to the browser, you can see the component is now a cart. Awesome. Now let's get back to the VS Code and set the class name here. Since we have the class name here, let's fix the typo in the interface. We're going to need the cn function here, cn, and then first we're going to pass the props.class name, and then before that we're going to put our own class name. So it is going to be a grid calls 1 for its responsiveness, and on medium screen and above we're going to have 3 columns. So I'm going to say grid calls 3. Okay, now inside this cart component, let's close the explorer here. Inside the cart component, first we're going to have an input for the property name. So we're going to choose the input component from the Next UI. Okay, let's set the label, which is going to be name here, and let's set the class name as well. We're going to say on medium screens and above, just take 3 columns of the grid system. So we're going to set its col span to 3. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see now we have the input elements here on the card. Let's get back to the VS Code, and here in the card let's have some padding p2, and now we can see the margin of the input element. Okay, now let's add the input for the description. We're going to have the text area from the Next UI, and let's have the label, which is going to be description, and let's also have the class name as the same as the previous input. Okay, and just set the label of the first input with the uppercase in the first letter. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see we have the name and description. Awesome. Let's get back to the VS Code, and then here we need to create a select component for selecting the type of the property. So here I'm going to use the select component from the Next UI. First we're going to have the label, which is going to be type, and set it to single, so only one item can be selected. And then as the children of this select element, we'll render its element. So let's add a ending tag for this select element. and inside it we are going to render the types that we have retrieved from our database, and here we've got them in the props of the component. So we're going to loop through the props.types. Actually, we're going to call the map function here. We're going to have the item, and for each item we're going to render a select item which comes from the Next UI. And inside the select item, first we need to set the key to item.id and value to also item.id. So when actually the item is selected, the onChange event of this select will return the ID of the selected item. Okay, we don't want the title of the item, we need the ID of the selected item. So that's why I set the value of the select item to the item.id and not item.value. And then here, as the caption or text of the select item, we're going to render the item.value. Now let's go to the browser. We have the type here, and you can see we have rendered the property types that we have retrieved from our database. Okay, before adding the property status here, let's add some gap for our grid system. Okay, here in the card element, we're going to use the gap3 class for the gap between the element in the grid system, and you can see it is much better now. Okay, now let's create the select item for the property status. So I just copy this code here and paste it here. First we are going to change the label to status. Okay, and here we're gonna loop through the props.statuses, and we're done with that. Let's go back to the browser. You can see now we have the statuses here: sold, for sale, and under contract. Nice. All we need to do here is to add an input for the price. So let's get back to the VS Code, and after the select item we're gonna have an input. So we can just copy the first one here, okay, and paste it here. We don't want the class name. Okay, let's remove the class name here, and we're going to set the label to price. Okay, let's save this and get back to the browser, and now we can see the price inputs here. And that's it for the designing of the basic step section. And before ending this section, let's add some space between the stepper element and the basic component. So get back to the VS Code, and I go to the add property form here, and let's add a class name to our form, and we're going to set the margin top to 3, for example. Get back to the browser. Let's add a padding as well. So here I'm going to say P2 for the padding. Okay, now I think it is much better. So that's it for the designing of the basic step section. And now let's go to the next section. In this section, we are going to add a next and Prev button in the basic step. So we can click on the next step and actually go to the next step, which is the location step. So now let's go back to the VS Code, and I go to the basic component, and here I scroll down to the end of the component, and after the price input, we are going to add another div where inside it we're going to put the next and Prev buttons. So inside it we are going to add 2 buttons. Okay, the first one is going to be the previous, and let's copy that, and the next one is going to be next. Since we are going to put this button side by side, we're going to add a class name to the parent div. We're going to add flex, justify center, and also since the card element, which contains this div, has a grid system, we are going to span this div through 3 columns on this div. So here we're going to say cool span 3. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. You can see the next and previous buttons here. First we need to set the width of each buttons equally. So get back here, I'm gonna add a class name here and set W36 for each button. Let's copy that and put it on the second button, and here let's set the color prop of each button to primary. Okay, again let's copy that and paste it on the second button. Let's save this, and here in the parent div let's put a gap between the elements. So I put gap 3 for the gap between these 2 buttons. Let's get back to the browser. Now we can see the width of the buttons is the same, and now we're going to add an icon in each button. So let's get back to the VS Code again, and here the next UI button has a start content props, and we can set it to another component, and this component will be rendered inside it in the left side. So in the first button, we're going to set the start content, and now we can render a icon from the hero icons library. We're going to have chevron left icon, okay, and set the class name and set the W6 for its width, okay. And now we're going to set the icons for the next button. So here we want to render an icon on the right side of the button. So here we're going to set the end contents of the next button, okay. And here inside it, we're going to use another icon from the hero icons, chevron right icon, and just set the class name and set the width to W6, okay. Let's get back to the browser. You can see now we have nice next and prev buttons. And here, since we are in the first step, we need to disable the previous button. We have a typo here. We're going to fix that in a second. And when we click on the next button, we want to move to the next section. So here, let's get back to the VS Code and first fix the typo here, okay. Now here we're going to set the is disabled prop in the previous button, so it will actually disable the previous button. And here when the user click on the next button, we want to move to the next section. So if I go to the add property form, which actually uses this basic component, you can see we have a state step for keeping the current step. So when we click on the next button inside the basic component, we need to actually increment this step state here. So I go back to the basic component, and here in the props of the component, we're going to define a next function, which is going to be a function that takes nothing and it returns void. Okay, now in the basic component, I'm going to create a function here, const handle next. It is going to be a function that for now calls the props.next. Okay, and then here we just go to the next button, and on the on-click event of the next button, we actually pass the handle next. Okay, now I go back to the add property form, and here we need to set the next prop. So I'm going to set the next here, and I'm going to pass a function, since it takes a function that calls the set step here and increment this step. So I use prev here and just return prev +1. Now let's get back to the browser. You can see the previous button is disabled here, and here if I click on the next, you can see now in the stepper we are on the second step, and here we want to show the basic form only if we are on the first step. So I get back to the add property form, and here in the basic component, we're going to set the class name here. We're going to use the cn function, and we're going to pass in conditional object because we are going to set a class name for hiding the basic component based on if this step is not equal to 0. So here we're going to pass the hidden class. Okay, it set the display of the component to none, and we are going to activate this class name only if the step here is not equal to 0. Okay, let's get back to the browser. You can see we are on the second step and the basic form is not shown here. And if I click on the basic step here, you can see again the basic form is shown. Go to the next section and the basic form is hidden. So now in the next section, we are going to create the location section for our add property form. In this section, we are going to create the location step of the add property form. So this is the final version of the add property form, and you can see we want to create this form just like this. We are going to add a street address, zip code, city, state, region, and landmarks. So first we are going to add these properties in our Prisma schema file, and then we are going to create this form. So now let's go back to the VS Code and go to the schema file, and we want to add the aforementioned properties to the property model. We can go ahead and put them directly inside the property model, or we can create a location model and put the properties relating to the location form on the location model, and then create a one-to-one relationship with the property model. So each instance or record of the property will be associated only with one record of the location model, and vice versa. So here I'm going to create a model called property location. So I'm going to say model property location, and let's define its fields. So first we're going to have an ID, which is going to be int, and it is going to be primary key of the table. And let's set the default decorator and call the arrow increment. So it's an arrow increment ID field. Then we're going to have the street address. Okay, and it's going to be string. We're going to have city. Actually, the better idea here is to create a city model and create a relationship with this property location. But let's just keep it simple and just save the city name and state name here as a string. So we're going to set its type to string here. in the same way, we're going to have the state, which is going to be a string. We're going to have the zip here. Again, its type is string. Region, its type is string as well. And finally, we're going to have a landmark, which is going to be string. So let's save this. And now let's go to our diagram tool and add this model to our diagram. So here we're going to have property location, and inside we're going to have ID. It is going to be int, and it is the primary key of the table. We have the street address. Okay, it is going to be string. We're going to have the city. Again, it is string, state, string, and let's make it a little bigger. Okay, we're going to have the zip, which is going to be string, region, string, and landmark. Again, it is going to be string. Now we are going to create the relationship between the property model and property location. So here each property has just one location, and each location only belongs to one property. So our relationship here is a one-to-one relation. So now let's define the relation here. First, we need to add a property ID inside the property location. We can also create a property location ID in the property model. It's up to you to choose where you are going to put your foreign key. So here I'm going to choose to put my foreign key in the property location. So inside the property location, we're going to have a property ID, which is going to be int. Okay, now we are going to create the relationship. So property location dot property ID, it is going to refer to the property ID of the property table. So it is going to be a one-to-one relationship. So I choose the one-to-one here and select the other side of the relationship, which is the property model. And here we are going to refer to the property ID. So property location dot property ID, which is our foreign key, will refer to the property dot ID. So you can see here, now we have a one-to-one relationship between the property and property location. So now let's get back to our schema file and implement this type of relationship. So as I said, first we need to decide on which side of the relationship we want to put our primary key. We have decided to put the primary key on the property location model. So we are going to have a property ID, which is going to be int. And now here we are going to create the relationship. So we are going to have a property and set its type to the property model. And if I save this, you can see it creates the relationship here. The field property ID in this table will refer to the ID of the property table. And here let's scroll up and go to the property model. Here we can see it adds a property location here in the property table. So here I just prefer to rename this field. You can leave it as it is, but I'm going to rename it to location. And here it is very important to remove this list sign here because it's a one-to-one relationship. So each property now has just one property location, and we need to set it as optional. Okay, now let's save this, and here we have an error and it says this is a one-to-one relationship, and we need to set the property ID here to be as unique. So here we're going to use the unique decorator. So as you can see, the error is gone, and now we have a one-to-one relationship between the property model and property location. So now let's move to the next section, which we are going to create our location part of our add property form. So this is the final version of the location form. And here as you can see, we want a grid system with 2 columns. So let's get back to the VS Code, and inside the components directory of the add property form, we are going to create a new component. I'm going to call it location.tsx. Let's create the component here, and first let's create an interface for its props. So I'm going to say interface props. It is going to have a next function, just like the basic form. It takes nothing and also returns nothing. Also, we're going to have a Prev function. Okay, again, it's a function that takes nothing and also returns nothing. Okay, and then we're going to have the class name, which is going to be optional, and its type is string. Okay, now let's have the props here, props, and set its type to props interface. And here in the JSX, let's replace the root div with a card component of the Next UI and set the class name here. We're going to set it to cn function, and we're going to pass the props.class name as the second parameter. And in the first one, we are going to set our own classes. So it is going to be a grid calls 1, and an empty screens, and above we're going to have 2 columns. So we're going to set grid calls 2 here, and we're going to have a gap tree for the space between the elements. Okay, now we just need to import the cn function from the Next UI, and here inside it we're going to have our first input. Let's import the input from the Next UI and set its label to just street address. Okay, now let's have our next button. So let's copy that and just rename the label to zip or postal code. We're going to have the third one, which is going to be city. So just rename the label to city. In the same way, we're going to have the input for the state. So let's rename the label to state. And we're going to have another one, which is for region or neighborhood. Okay, now we need to set the class name here because we are going to span this element on two columns. We're going to have col span 2, and then as the last input here we're going to have a text area. So I use the text area from the Next UI. Okay, and let's set the label to landmarks, and we're going to set the class name to col span 2 because we are going to span this text area on two columns in our grid system, just like the previous one, region input. Okay, let's save this and go back to our browser. So this is the final version, and here this is our application. Let's go to the next section. So here, as you can see, we have nothing here, and that's because we need to go to the add property form and render the location form after the basic component. So here we're going to have the location. So make sure that you are importing that from the location file that is on the same directory. Okay, now we need to specify next prop here. We're going to pass a function that calls the set step and just increment the step state and return the prev plus 1. And in the same way, we need to specify the prev prop here. It is going to be a function as well, just like the next. So let's copy this one, paste it here. We just need to decrement the step state here. Okay, and then we need to set the class name. We're going to have the cn function here because we're going to add conditional classes here. Cn, pass a conditional object, hidden class, only if this step is not equal to 2. Let's save this, get back to the browser. So this is the basic component, and let's go to the next step, but the location form is not here. So let's get back to the property form. Here, as you can see, we need to change this condition to step is not equal to 1. So actually we're going to show the location form only if this step is 1. So if this step is 0, we're going to remove this hidden class from the basic, and basic component will be shown. And if the step is 1, we're going to remove this hidden class from the location, and the location component is shown. So let's get back to the browser, and this is the basic one. Go to the next one. You can see now we have on the location form. So now let's go back and put some padding in the location form. Get back to VS Code. I just go to the basic one, and here I just copy the P2 here from the basic and go to the location form and just paste it here. Okay, let's get back to the browser. Okay, now we are going to just render the next and prev buttons inside the location form. So I just go back to the basic one and just copy the button section and go to the location form, and here paste it after the last input. Okay, let's import the missing imports, and here let's import this one and also this one, and here let's go to the basic component and just copy the handles next and go to the location and paste it here. So you might ask why I don't take the next and prev buttons from the location form and just put them directly in the add property form, so we don't need to create this next and prev buttons on each of these steps. I believe this is a good idea, but here, since we are going to validate the inputs when we click on the next, I think it is better to have separate buttons. So in each button, we can just validate the inputs inside its form. So in this way, we can separately validate the inputs inside each step. So that's why I create the prev and next button in all of these steps components here in this add property form. Okay, now let's go back to the previous one, and here we don't want the previous button to be disabled. So I removed it is disabled prop here and get back to the browser. Let's go to the next step. Here we are in the location step, and here if I click on the previous one, it doesn't do anything. That's because we need to set its onClick event. So here in the previous button, I'm going to set the onClick event to the props.prev. Okay, now if I get back to the browser, click on the previous button, you can see we go back to the previous step, go to the next step and get back to the previous step. Awesome. So that's it for this section, and in the next section, we are going to create the feature section of our add property form. In this section, we are going to create the features part of the add property form. So first we need to create the features model in the Prisma.schema file and add these fields in that model. And then we are going to create this form and put it on the add property form. So now let's get back to the VS Code. I go to the Prisma.schema file, and here we're going to create the property feature model. So I'm going to say model property feature. Okay, and then the first field is going to be ID, which its type is int, and it is going to be the primary key of the table. So I use the ID decorator here, and let's have a default value for it and call the auto increment. So it is going to be in auto increment ID field. Then we're going to have the bedrooms, which is actually the number of the bedrooms in the property. So its type is int. We're going to have bathrooms, which is the number of the bathrooms in the property, and we're going to have parking spots, which is going to be an int. We're going to have area, which is also is a int, and then we're going to have has swimming pool, which is going to be a boolean, and we're going to have has garden or yard, which is going to be a boolean, and then we're going to add the has balcony, which is going to be a boolean as well. So this is our model property feature, and now let's go to our diagram tool and add this model inside the diagram. So here we're going to create the property feature. It is going to have an ID, which is int, and it is going to be the primary key of the table. We're going to have bedrooms, int, bathrooms, it is going to be an int again, parking spots, it also is a integer. We're going to have area, which is also is a int. Then we're going to have as swimming pool, which is going to be a boolean, as garden or yard, which also is a boolean, and then we're going to have has balcony, which also is a boolean. Okay, now here this is our property feature, and we need to create a one-to-one relationship between the property feature model and the property model. So each record inside the property model is only associated with just one record in the property feature model, and vice versa. So here, as I said in the previous sections, when we're going to have a one-to-one relationship, we need to create a foreign key field that refers to the primary key of the other table inside the relationship. So it's up to you to choose where you're going to put your foreign key. You can put it inside the property feature or property. In this case, I just prefer to put it inside the property feature model. So let's add a property ID here, which its type is going to be int. And now let's create the relationship in our diagram. So here property feature dot property ID, we're going to have a one-to-one relationship, and the other side of the relationship is property, and we are going to refer to the ID of the property table. Okay, so now here you can see that we have a one-to-one relationship between the property model and the property feature. Now let's go to our Prisma.schema file and create this relationship in our schema. So let's add a property ID here, but I prefer to just add a property field, which its type is going to be from property model. So if I save this, the Prisma is smart enough and create the property ID field for me, which its type is int, and also a relationship here that says that field property ID inside this model, this property ID will refer to the ID of the property model. So here, since it is a one-to-one relationship, we're going to mark it with the @unique here. And if I save this and go to the property model here, you can see it creates the property feature for me. And here, since it is a one-to-one relationship, we need to remove this list sign here and then mark it with question mark. And I just prefer to rename this field to just feature. Okay, so the name of the field is up to you. Let's save this. We don't have any error here, and we have created a one-to-one relationship between the property feature and property model. So let's save this and let's create a migration here. Let's first clear this up, and here I'm going to say npx prisma migrate dev and then dash name. But the name here, for example, adding feature. Okay, let's run that. Okay, it is done, and now we can move into the next section in which we are going to create the feature section from the add property form. Now in this section we are going to create this form. So we need to create a 2-column grid here and put these fields inside this grid system. So let's get back to the VS Code here, and I go to the components directory of the add property form, we're going to create another component called features.tsx, then create a component here. So let's close this off here, also this, okay. And now we're going to create the interface for the feature form. So let's get back to the location here and just copy the interface, and then I get back to the features and paste it here. Okay, now we can have props of the component and set its type to props interface. Then we are going to replace this div here with a card component from the Next UI. Then just go to the location here and then copy the class name, get back to the features, and first let me change the ending tag with card, and then we can paste the class name here. We need to import the CN function. Let's save this, and now we can put our inputs here. So let's put the first one, inputs, which comes from the Next UI. We're going to set the label and set it to bedrooms. Okay, now let's create the second one, which is going to be bathrooms. So let's change the label to bathrooms. Then we're going to have the parking spots, and let's change the label to parking spots. Then we're going to have another one for area. So let's change the label to area. Okay, so now let's see it in the browser, but first we need to put it inside the add property form here. So let's copy this one and paste it here. We just need to change it to feature. Okay, let's save this. Okay, and then we just need to change the condition of the class name to step is not equal to 2. Okay, now let's get back to the browser. We have the bedrooms, bathrooms, parking spot, and area. And let's go to the final version. You can see we need to add these 3 checkboxes here. So I go back to the VS Code and go to the features section. We're going to have a div here, and inside this div we're going to put the 3 checkboxes. So let's add a class name. We're going to have flex and item sender, and also justify between. Okay, now we can span this div through 2 columns. So I say cool span 2, and then here we can put our checkboxes. So I use the checkbox component from the Next UI. Okay, I import it from the Next UI, and then inside it as the children we can put the label of the checkbox. I'm going to set it to has swimming pool. Okay, let's save this, and let's add the next one, which is has garden or yard. So change the children of it to has garden or yard. So add another one. We are going to change the label to the has balcony or patio. Let's save this and get back to the browser. Go to the features section. Now we can see we have the has swimming pool, has garden or yard, and has balcony or patio. So let's put them closely together, and in order to do that we just need to remove this cool span 2, and if I save that, now we can see they are close enough together. Now we are going to put the next and Prev buttons. So I go back to the VS Code and just go to the location section and just copy this from the location, and let's get back to the features. And after this div here, let's put these buttons. So let's import the missing one. Okay, now we need to create a handle next function. So let's get back to the location, just copy that, get back to the features, and paste it here in the features component. So the error is gone, and here if I click on the next button inside the features, and here you can see the grid system is broken. So let's get back to the VS Code here, and here inside the div that contains the buttons, we are setting this to cool span 3, which we need to set it to cool span 2 because we have only 2 columns. Okay, let's save this, and you can see now the grid system is working without any problem. And if I click on the next, you can see I go to the next section, and if I click on the previous, you can see I'm going back to the previous section. Also, we need to fix the grid system inside the location. So let's get back to the location. I think the error is because of this div that contains the buttons, and we have set the cool span to 3, but we need to set it to cool span 2 because we have only 2 columns. Let's save this, get back to browser. Now we can see the grid system is working well. Okay, so that's it for this section, and since this video is getting too long, I need to split this tutorial on 2 sections. So you can watch the rest of it on the second part of this tutorial. And this is the list of the topics that we are going to cover on the second part of this tutorial. And also the link of the second part will be here.